friends, and welcome back to the Rewind podcast of Forward Church. Join us each week as we take a look back on Sunday's message and dig a little deeper into the conversations with those who are teaching across our sites at Forward. We want to invite you to be part of the conversation too. So if something we're talking about on Sunday morning sparks a question in you, head to our website, forwardchurch.ca/ask us, and submit your questions there. And we're going to do our best to engage with those questions. Hey, and welcome back to the Rewind podcast. My name is Rachel. I'm your host today. And with me is Pastor Kirk. Welcome to the podcast with me.
Rachel, it's good to be with you. I hear your voice on there all the time, and now you're here.
I'm here in person. It has been...
It's been a minute.
Yeah. It has been a minute, but... I think
look at us sounding all cool. It's been a minute.
It's been a minute. My kids will make fun of me. My husband probably will as well. But yeah, here we are. No one wanted to host this podcast with you today.
Okay, we need to give some context.
And I'm excited because I love most sermons, but I really like the idea of being an ambassador, and that's what we're going to talk about.
I'm glad you like the idea of something that's in the Bible. That's good.
I know. What a novel idea for someone who works in the church. So Kirk, why don't you tell us where we were on Sunday? Give us a little rundown.
Sure. Yeah, I was in Cambridge, and we were talking about, we're wrapping up our series on Mission Forward. So just taking us through the journey of our mission as a church family. And so we talked before about what does it mean to be disciples of Jesus and make disciples of Jesus. And we went, love God, love others. And this week, really zeroing in on that part of the mission statement that talks about making disciples who serve the world. And so we were in 2 Corinthians chapter 5 this past Sunday. And really, for me, I framed the message with a question. And the question was, how can your love for God and others on Sunday spill over to the rest of the week? Or if you want to flip it around into a negative question, it was, what's stopping us, or what needs to change in us that in order for us to serve the world around us throughout the rest of the week and not just be focused on like a God box on Sunday.
Right.
And so we just dove into this passage and tried to pull out some practical things for our lives.
And really, for this sermon and this mission for us to be and serve as Christ ambassadors, you really have to be rooted in your love of God.
Yeah, you do. Yeah, the whole way through, and I would say even rooted deeper in the sense of God's love for you. Mm-hmm. That the only way you can really love God or love others or serve the world is that you are really rooted yourself in how great God's love is towards you. Otherwise, it just becomes a set of tasks to accomplish in the Christian life instead of something that's overflowing out of the reality of the relationship that you have with God because of what He's done for you.
Yeah, and there's a danger to be task-oriented mission makers.
Yeah, absolutely. And for those of us who love to accomplish tasks and advance projects and, be able to celebrate our own personal achievements in life, this is one of those things where if you try to do this on your own strength and you just try to make this up, you can actually do it for a while. Mm-hmm. Many people have done it for a while, but you will eventually run dry. Right. Because the source of everything is Jesus Himself. The source of the spiritual life is Him. He says it in John 15. Jesus says, you can do nothing apart from me, when He's teaching about abiding in the vine. So our very ability to love God, our very ability to serve others, or love others and serve the world is rooted in the reality of Christ in us, not in what I can come up with on my own.
Right. And I think you asked this question in your sermon, or I made it as my note, but the question of, does the gospel still move you? So on one side, we're either task-oriented. Yeah. There's the caution on the other side where if the gospel is just something you have always had and you lose the depth of it, you run a risk on the other end of being complacent because it's just Jesus and you kind of water it down too.
Oh yeah. And it's one of those things, it's interesting. I've had people in our church say to me, man, like you guys preach the gospel every single Sunday. And I say, yeah, it's because we really only have one message. Mm-hmm. Like we have one message, but there's thousands of different ways to present the message,
Right.
but our story as Christians is the gospel. Unfortunately, and I talked a little bit about this in the message on Sunday, and I don't know if you've ever experienced this, Rachel, but for me, I've had moments in my Christian journey where the gospel became, I'll use the word normal. Mm-hmm. I'd heard it so many times, it went in one ear and out the other. I almost became bored.
Right.
Have you ever experienced that?
Yeah, and I think I grew up in the church. I was born into the church. I went to Christian camp over the summer, so it was always there. It was just what it was, and it does become a little less impactful. I think there was moments of my life where it was like, yeah. Like, I know this story. I'm just going to glaze over it. And you kind of lose sight of the majesty of God and the sacrifice of Jesus. And really, it shifted in me becoming an ambassador and understanding that. That's why I love this sermon, because that was one of those hinge points for me. I'll tell a quick story. I have a love of running. And there was a run company who was offering ambassadorship. So you got a discount on their products. And I'm like, I'm in for that. And then partway through that first year, I was like, oh man, I'm so excited to be an ambassador for this product. But I don't share the same enthusiasm for being an ambassador of Jesus. And that really shifted for me of like, if I can love a product, how much more should I love God and share it with people? And so that began to change my view of the gospel and the impact, because that is the call in my life, to be that ambassador.
Yeah.
And so I've lived it. I am trying to live the other end of being a good ambassador for Christ.
Yeah.
Not that I get it perfect, but
That's a great story. I love that story, because I think there's a lot of us that can relate to feeling those same things. If you've spent any length of time in church life, and you've heard the gospel enough times, I think part of the reason why we do get bored with the gospel is because our conversations around the gospel usually are about a transactional thing that has happened at some point in my past. And there is this feeling of, I should move past that transaction and move on to other things in my life. But the reality is, and this is what I tried to bring out a bit on Sunday, is if you step back and look at your life, and you look at your relationship with God, and you look at what God does for you day in and day out, all of it's rooted in the gospel. The fact that, I use the example, the fact that I got to wake up this morning, say a prayer that just started with Heavenly Father, right? Just being able to start a prayer with those two words, that alone only happens because of the gospel.
right.
If there is no gospel, there is no opportunity for me to sit there and say, Heavenly Father,
Right.
because I'm not his son.
Yep.
Right? And every day there are so many things that we experience and encounter as Christians that we forget they are rooted in the story of the gospel and the truth of the gospel and what Jesus has done for us. I remember, I'll give people a book to read in a minute. But there's this idea that we need to keep coming back to the gospel as a place to constantly shape our lives. So when I was going through my ordination process, it was one of those moments where you're super nervous and you're thinking about, am I going to get the answers right to these questions? And I've got these people who are way smarter than I am who are interrogating me, and they're going to pick apart little words that I say or don't say. And so you get into your own head. And I remember at the beginning of my ordination, somebody said to me, like, how are you doing? Because I started, I think, at like 1 o'clock in the afternoon or something. So I had the whole morning to keep thinking about. And they said, how you doing? And I said, honestly, I have just spent the whole morning preaching the gospel to myself. Because for me, here's how, in my anxious mind, I was worried about all the potential for failure. preaching the gospel to myself said, you know what, Kirk, even if you fail at this, you're still a son of God. Mm-hmm. Like, it is not the end of the world if you fail at this. There's something far greater and far more important than whether or not you pass or fail the test that you're about to take. And that just like calmed my heart and my mind right down by constantly reminding myself of the gospel and how it still shapes my life.
Right. And that, I mean, plays into all, it should, or ought to play into all aspects of our lives. Because I think you said it at the beginning of your sermon, like, what stops you and from sharing the gospel?
Yeah.
And I mean, I think about it, and I'm sure for most people, it's that fear, either fear of what people are going to think, fear of failure and getting it wrong, fear of disappointing, fear of losing.
I think that's what people say. I don't think that's what's really going on.
What do you think is really going on then?
I think what's really going on is some of the things I started to unpack on Sunday. I think that we don't really see the desperate condition that people are in. Mm-hmm. We don't see people through the eyes of God, right? So, like, if I saw someone drowning, I wouldn't sit there and go, man, I'm afraid that I'm going to go underwater myself, so I'm not going to rescue them. Right? Like, we're going to do something to try to rescue them.
Most people.
Yeah. Yes. You're going to ask me that question, aren't you?
I'm going to ask it later.
Okay. Yeah. Like, if I see somebody in a difficult situation, right? Like, if you genuinely care about those people, you don't let fear be what defines your action.
This is true.
Right?
Yeah.
So we can say, I'm afraid I'm going to say it wrong, or I'm afraid I'm going to mess up. But that's a surface level answer. At the heart of it, it's simply, we don't really see people through the eyes of God. We don't see the desperate condition that people are in and how much they need to be moved from being an enemy of God to being reconciled with God, as I talked about on Sunday, right? And so we need to have our own hearts changed to see people through the eyes of God. And the more that we see people through the eyes of God, and the more that we understand our identity as being ambassadors for Jesus, the more that those two things come together and drive us to be people who serve the world well.
Right. And I think you brought that up in your sermon when you talk about it might be good for me and it's not good for you.
Yeah.
And you talk about the Druppies.
Yeah, I talk about the Druppies.
And they may be, we know that they're good for Derek. Derek has
said
awful.
They're awful. Come on, let's be honest.
They're like a weird. So I have a Dutch half of my family.
Yeah.
So we eat them, and they're one of the things that I try to like.
You make an effort.
I try.
I'm glad you make an effort.
Thank you.
If anybody, like, honestly, if anybody leaves a bag of Druppies for me after what I said on Sunday, I just want you to know I won't be eating them.
Okay, but this comes to the question you were alluding to a minute ago.
Yes, because you cornered me with this question.
I did corner you, and I think
you set me up for failure with this question.
But you're answering it honestly. But I think in the same way, when we dig into what stops us from sharing, so would you eat a Druppie if you had to eat a bag of them every day to save someone's life?
Probably not.
You wouldn't do it.
Probably not.
And I asked you off air, would you do it for Shannon?
And I said, okay, here's the sarcastic answer I gave, because I need to actually clarify this is a sarcastic answer before someone jumps all over me. The sarcastic answer I gave was, she's going to heaven. It'll be fine.
Right. And we know that.
Yeah.
Sure.
So she doesn't need me to eat all the Druppies. She's going to heaven.
Right.
It's fine.
But you would eat a bag.
If me eating a bag of Druppies for the sake of my wife would save her in some way, shape, or form, I would eat a bag of Druppies.
And so in light of the gospel, we may say in those situations, well, the gospel is good for me, but it's not good for you.
Yep.
We ought to be compelled to be like, it needs to be good for you because your life, your eternal salvation is on the line.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the thing that's part of the seeing people through the eyes of God, right? Like when you live in the space, one of the concerns that I have is there are an increasingly higher number of Christians who no longer have non-Christian relationships.
Yeah, that was an interesting.
So we put ourselves in a bubble
Yep.
of, I'm just going to surround myself with more Christians.
Right.
And we don't really interact or engage with anybody who's not a Christian.
Right.
And if you're blocking yourself off completely from people who don't know Jesus, it's impossible for you to live out the Great Commission.
Yeah.
You can't obey Jesus.
No.
And so, I think that people need to, this is, again, parsing people through the eyes of God. Mm-hmm. When you understand just how desperate the condition is that people are in, it should motivate you. It should. And if it doesn't, mm-hmm. there should be bigger questions that are going on. Like, why do I not care about the people who are around me? Maybe I don't even realize how great the gospel has been in my own life.
Mm-hmm. I wrote down, like, what does it say about our hearts and the condition of our hearts if we can't get to that place of saying, you need Jesus?
Yeah, it is an incredibly unloving thing to allow someone to continue to move towards their eternal death. Mm-hmm. Right? The interesting thing is that we sometimes will flip it around and say, but the most loving thing is to let people kind of get there on their own.
Right.
Right? Or let people believe whatever they want to believe. That's the most loving thing that I can do. But that is, the nicest way of putting it is that's just a cop-out. Mm-hmm. Because it's not the most loving thing you can do when you know what the end result is.
Right. It might feel, quote unquote, loving here.
Right.
On this side of heaven.
Right.
But in the scope of eternity, it's the least loving thing you can do.
Exactly. Yeah. And you have to, again, I keep coming back to, I don't really think that we see the people around us through the eyes of God. I just think if we did, mm-hmm. God is moved with compassion for us when he sees us in our helpless estate. God is moved with mercy towards us when he sees even just how much we've offended him. God, he gives and gives and gives of himself, which is grace. It's us receiving all of God's riches at the expense of Jesus, mm-hmm. right? It's such a unfair exchange on every level, and yet that's how much God wanted to be reconciled to us, right? And there's just that sense of urgency mm-hmm. that God shows.
So how does one foster that into their own lives? I mean, it's really easy to talk about it. I think in the past we've probably talked about it on the podcast, and I know we've talked about it in discipleship. But the example of like, help me. I think we've talked about it in relationship to spouses, but I mean, this can go into how we see others. But help me see my husband as Christ sees him, or vice versa. How do I see my wife? So how do we apply that into our own lives that in a practical way?
Yeah. So, I mean, the first thing that I talked about on Sunday is the starting point of seeing all people through the eyes of God is seeing people, first of all, as people made in the image of God, mm-hmm. which means every person is due respect and honor and acknowledgement of their value as a person. That alone is a huge step mm-hmm. for a lot of people, because there are many people that are in our lives where our immediate thought is they're just annoying, they're just this, they're just whatever word you want to put, but we don't sit there and start with, no, they are a human being made in the image of God.
Right.
So that's your starting point. Like what's your first go-to thought when you're thinking about certain people that you interact with each day?
Are you asking me?
No.
Oh,
because Keith's in the room, and I could ask you, what's your first thought when you think about Keith every day?
When I see Keith in the hallway, I'm like, hey, Keith. That's my first thought.
That's
say hi to Keith.
Cop-out. That's like a it's fine answer. That's not even taking a side. You're Switzerland on that one.
Listen, I'm not a morning person, so like when I see anyone in the morning, I'm like, ugh.
But Paul in this passage says that we no longer see people the way that the world sees people. That the mark of a disciple of Jesus is that we see people differently. We have a different lens than the rest of the world has when we're talking about people. But unfortunately, when I'm interacting with people and they want to complain about someone, very rarely does someone lead with, I know this person has incredible value and they are made in the image of God and God has gifted them and wired them. And like very rarely does anybody lead with that.
Right.
It's almost always, this person's an idiot and they're driving me crazy.
And God made them that way.
So you get, I'm not even going to answer that. So you get into this space where if you're leading with looking at people with the same kind of language and lens that everybody else in the world would, you're never going to see people through the eyes of God.
Right.
Right. So you have to be able to step back and to look at it through the lens of, do I see them as an image bearer of God? Then from there, it boils into, like, I walked through this picture that from God's perspective, every person falls into one of two categories. You're a Christian or you're not a Christian.
Right.
Right. And it's really as simple as that. You're a Christian or you're not a Christian.
Yep.
From God's perspective. And if you want to think about, okay, what about all the Christians? Well, that's where we talked about the love others, right? And the Bible's filled with one another's.
Yep.
That if you focus some energy on the one another's, you will take the rest of your life figuring out how to relate to the people who are Christians.
Right.
And then if you look at the people who are non-Christians, what this passage goes to is you're Christ's ambassadors.
Yeah.
Right? So no longer are they just the person that drives me crazy or even the nice person who I really like to hang out with. It's, no, what does it mean to me, for me to be an ambassador for Jesus to this person?
Right. And that's a conversation that we easily have with our children.
Right. Well,
so sometimes we have that conversation in our home with one of our children who is a Christ follower.
Yeah.
She's been baptized, so she is publicly declared. She's very vocal, but she's very justice oriented.
Yeah.
So the conversation often comes up is you're representing Jesus.
yeah.
To your schoolmates, to your teammates, to your friends. So what do your actions say about you and your relationship with him?
Right.
And I mean, it's easy to say it to my kids, and it's really difficult to also say it to us.
Yeah.
That relationship, that reflection that God is telling us this thing that we tell our kids, but he is our father. And so I'm always reminded in parent relationships that when I say it to my kids, it's also Rachel, check yourself, because God's also telling you that exact same thing.
Right. One of the things, just since you brought up parents, I was thinking about as I was working on the sermon was you and I and the rest of our discipleship team a while ago, we read a report that came out on parenting on faith issues. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that really was surprising in the report were the number of Christian parents, very significantly high. I forget the exact percentage now, so I'm not going to say a number, but it was a really high number of Christian parents who are parenting through the lens of, I'll just let my kids make their own choices, and we're not really going to talk about faith at home.
Right.
Right. Mm-hmm. And I just want to say, like, if you're in that spot as a parent and you're a Christian, think about, what does it mean? You are sent as Jesus's ambassadors to your kids. Like, that's your starting point. These are the people who are in your life the most out of anybody else.
Yep.
So what does it mean to be an ambassador for Jesus to your kids?
Right.
Don't live in the space of, well, I'll just let them figure it out, because that, when you do that, you're falling into the trap of what's good for me may not be good for you.
Right.
Right. But if you really believe that Jesus is the only way to eternal life,
yep,
then you cannot fall into that trap of, you can't afford to fall into that trap.
No.
Of going, what's good for me may not be good for you.
Right. And why would you want to? Because these are people who you love immensely.
Right.
They are in your home. You either birthed them or they are your children
them,
by adoption.
Whatever. Yeah.
Like that deep parental love.
Yeah.
I mean, you could even extend it into grandparent love. you just care so much for them.
Yep.
That why wouldn't you want
Yeah,
to?
exactly.
Yeah, and this is your starting point. If you can't do it in your home, it's going to be really hard to replicate that in the world where people are not so interconnected with you.
Yep.
Through that.
Now, I mean, with our kids, one of the things, it was a fine line because I did not want my kids to make a decision to follow Jesus because, well, it's my dad and my mom, and I'll just do it because they told me I had to do it.
Yep.
Right. So it was a really fine line. So one of the things that we did as parents was we always shared the gospel with our kids, but we never actually asked them to make a decision.
Right.
We just left it.
Yep.
And then we would pray and we would just say, Lord, would you take our kids and would you just take what we've talked to them about and would you bring that to life for them? And, one of the coolest things in my entire life is all 4 of my kids on their own came to me and said, Dad, would you help me come to faith in Jesus? Yeah. Right. And so like, it doesn't get better than that.
No.
And I was so grateful that that my kids didn't do it just because we were forcing something on them.
Yep.
But at the same time, we couldn't stay quiet about it. We had to keep inviting them to consider following Jesus and what it meant for their lives.
It's that overflow. Your love
Right.
of God should overflow out of your life
Right.
and be a reflection to others. We I shared this story. I'll share it again. We have friends of ours who we're getting to know, and they weren't part of a church. They would say they're unchurched, and our faith comes up in conversation all the time. And we got called out one day. We're sitting having dinner together, and they're like, well, faith is so important to you. Why haven't you invited us to church?
Right.
And it was like one of those moments where we're like,
Oh, yeah.
man, we're talking about it and we're talking about it. And they just needed that invitation.
Right.
To
You're right. So there's a lot of Christians who get into their own heads and you already make up people's minds for them.
Right.
I'll say that, like, if you're in that spot, because I don't think you're alone. I think there's tons of people who are faithfully living out as ambassadors of Jesus, but they never invite people
Yeah.
to kind of take another step, right? And sometimes it's like they're going to say no if I invite them to come to church. Right? But statistically, there's a number of studies that have been done that say people are actually just waiting for you to invite them.
Yeah.
And we've just made up people's minds. We don't give them a chance to answer the question. We've answered the question for them.
Yep.
But why would you do that?
Yeah. Don't make the no for them.
Right.
Let them make their own no.
Right.
Yep. Yeah. It's a thing. So
It is a thing.
I'll challenge you. If you're sitting on the other end listening to this, then just make the ask.
Yeah.
I mean, if they're true friends, they're going to say no and still love you anyways.
Yep.
But you don't know what's on the other side.
Right.
Yeah. So make that ask. You spent a lot of time talking about reconciliation. We haven't really touched on that part, but I think we would be foolish not to talk about that, the desire and the need to be reconciled, because we were reconciled with Christ, and the need to be reconciled with others is also there. So what do you want to talk about reconciliation? How do you want to jump into that one?
Yeah. So I made a comment on Sunday where I said, if you have no desire to be reconciled to the people around you, how on earth could you ever carry or have any desire to carry out the ministry of reconciliation to people who don't know Jesus? Like, if you are quite comfortable with just going, well, like, I don't like this person and I don't really care if we're ever really reconciled. I think that you'll have a very challenging time being motivated long-term to sharing the gospel with people, because reconciliation obviously is just not a high priority in your life. Reconciliation it's essential to the gospel story. That's what Paul's getting at here. He's experienced reconciliation with God through what Jesus has done for us, that he recognizes how he was an enemy of God, and God has now made him a child of God. And so there is this, hey, I've been reconciled to God, and now God's given me the ministry of reconciliation. So I just think it is at the heart of Jesus. There's a passage where Jesus talks about the urgency of reconciliation, even when it comes to bringing our offerings before the Lord. He talks about how if you know that your brother has something against you, he says, don't bring your offerings to God. First go and be reconciled to your brother. Then you can come bring your offerings to the Lord. Like, that's the kind of urgency that God has to the idea of reconciliation and the calling for reconciliation in our relationships.
Now, this can pose a challenge for some people.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, reconciliation, we can understand that we have to do it and that it's right and that's the next best thing and all those. But I mean, human relationships aren't that easy. So how would you approach it? Let's say you know in your heart you need to reconcile with someone. You want to bring your offerings to God. You want to be in right relationship, but you know that on the other end there's someone who does not want that same thing. How do you reconcile that reconciliation?
Yeah, and sometimes you can't. Like I one of the things I said on Sunday is reconciliation requires two things. It requires someone acknowledging they're wrong, and it requires another person releasing that person of the wrong. Right. So reconciliation and forgiveness are very close to each other, but forgiveness is one side of the reconciliation process. Right. So in order for reconciliation to truly work, you have to have both of those things happening. So yeah, if one person doesn't want to be reconciled, that doesn't change your desire for reconciliation. It just means you aren't able to be reconciled to that person because they don't want to be reconciled. Right. So our measurement of success, if you will, in a conversation like that is, was I faithful to Jesus?
Yeah.
Did I do the things that Jesus wanted me to do?
Right.
Like if I was sitting down and having coffee with Jesus, is he going to call me out for anything that I skipped over in this relationship? Or is he going to sit there and say, you know what, Kirk, you did everything that you could have done. And they still decided they didn't want to be reconciled to you. And frankly, God understands that because the same thing happens with God.
Right.
Like he's done everything you could possibly do to be reconciled with people. He sends his son to die on a cross, and he keeps reaching out to people in different ways to say, hey, I want to be reconciled to you. And people still sometimes go, not really interested.
Right.
And so, when you are in that spot and you're struggling, and it's hard, man, it's hard when you're in a relationship like that and the other person doesn't want to be reconciled. It is brutal. The emotions, the things that you struggle with in your head. Did I do enough? Did I say something wrong? And you analyze and overanalyze. There's the temptation towards anger and bitterness. There's so many things that get riled up in a moment like that, or in a situation like that. But the best place to be, first of all, is know this, that God completely understands what you're experiencing because God has people who don't want to be reconciled to him.
Yeah.
So you can go to God knowing that he completely understands it. And you can also live in a space of being able to say, hey, in my own heart of hearts, did I do everything that I could have done?
Right.
And if the answer is yes to that question, that you were faithful to God and doing the things that he asked you to do, that's where then you have the freedom to be able to go back to God and say, God, I just have to release this to you and trust that you're going to work something out over the long haul.
Right. It's, that heart posture of trying to be obedient to what God is inviting you into.
Yeah. Yeah. Like you think about the story of the prodigal son. And there is this reality where the father's trying to do what he can to help his son, and the son says, I'm out.
Yeah.
I'm leaving anyway. And he just goes.
Right.
And like all this period of time, that father has no idea what's going on with his son. Doesn't know where he is, doesn't know what's going on in his life. He just knows there is separation between him and his son. And so there is this reality where you're in a waiting game. You don't know what's going to happen, right? In that story, of course, there's the good news of what happens when the son returns home. But that's not always everybody's story. You don't always get the happy ending.
No. And I guess that kind of is a reminder too of like why it's so important to invest in the lives of those around you during the time that you have those relationships. And I mean, some things are out of our control, but you can control how much you love and how gracious and kind and loving and how you are that ambassador of Christ in those moments.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, you that's what you're in control of is, am I living as an ambassador for Jesus in every moment?
Yeah.
And if the person's shutting you down, that doesn't mean you have failed in living as an ambassador for Jesus.
Right. And it also doesn't give you permission to also shut that person out and treat them the same way. Like it still calls us back to
how do you see people?
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah. And I mean, they're easy to say. It's an easy list to give.
Oh, it's brutal to do.
It's terrible.
It is. It's terrible to do.
Yep.
Like when anyone who's ever walked through any real significant conflict in a relationship knows the kind of emotions that go into that conflict.
Yep.
And the fears that go into it. What's going to happen? What's not going to happen? What are we going to miss out on? All the fears that happen, right? And there's just so much that is, so much that is unknown, and you're literally it is such a place to grow in your faith, where you have to choose to say yes to doing the things that Jesus wants you to do, and you have to just release the outcome to God. Now, there's a flip side to it. Like, what if you're the person who doesn't want to reconcile?
Oh, that is a good flip side.
Right? Yeah. I've been burned so many times, and I just don't want to reconcile with this person.
Right. But I mean, in that, it just reminds me, like the women are walking through some Old Testament, so we're in covenant promises, which makes me think of Israel. Think about how many times Israel just turned their backs on God and said, I'm going to do it my way. Your way is not working. I'm going to do it my way. And I mean, they did it so many times, yet God was still faithful and good to them. And in turn, he is still faithful and good to us, keeping those promises from Genesis all the way. We're still living out God's faithful promises to us. So even though we are burned or have been burned, how much more does that make us need to flip and see what God did? His people burned him time after time after time, and yet he still loved them and sent his son. Yeah,
that's such a great example. When I've talked to people who have a hard time with the idea of forgiving someone or being reconciled to someone, one of the conversations, I mean, and it's a journey. Like here's what I will say. I'm not putting this out there to someone to say, just flip a switch and everything's fine.
Yes, it doesn't generally work like that.
As humans, it just doesn't, because we're processing a whole bunch of emotions. Yeah. So I want people to hear that, I don't want you to hear this just, hey, just do this and everything's fine. Yeah. It is a journey that you have to work through. But the direction we should be pointed in as Christians is to understand that reconciliation is at the heart of God. And when I'm talking to people about this process, one of the kind of rubber meets the road kind of moments is usually when they'll say something like, man, this is so hard. Like, it is so hard to do this. And you're right. It is very hard to do this. And then I'll say something along the lines of, it makes you really appreciate so much more what God has done for you. Because what I love about the idea of being reconciled to God, and I mentioned this in the sermon on Sunday, it means that our sins, past, present, future, are forgiven. So that means, by default, God already knew when he reconciled with us. He already knew that we were going to keep actually failing him. Mm-hmm. And he said, I still want to be reconciled, even though I know you're going to keep doing things.
Right.
Right? Where we land in the space of going, I can't be reconciled because they're going to keep doing things to hurt me.
Yep.
God says, I want to be reconciled, even though I know they're going to be doing things to hurt me.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's such a completely different value on relationships than what we put on relationships.
Yeah.
And so for me, and this is something I've worked through in my own life. Like, I want people to know I am not speaking purely from a theoretical, this is, thou shalt do this because the Bible says it. This is having walked through the journey of needing to forgive and be forgiven, to reconcile with someone. It is brutally hard, but when you trust God with the process and you receive what God has done for you and you contemplate that and live in what God's done for you, he's the one that's going to give you the strength to be able to enter into this level of forgiveness and reconciliation.
Yeah, I would say that would be the same in my life. I think of who I am and what I am capable on my own.
Yeah.
And like forgiveness is not one of those things that come naturally.
That's shocking.
I know. And so in moments where I have had to forgive and reconcile in situations, I'm actually blown away at Christ's work in me. Because I'm like, this is not typical to my nature or my character or my own abilities. And it is that evidence of Christ at work in our lives.
Yeah.
And it
is. Absolutely. So I said earlier that I was going to recommend a book to people. So I want to do that because it ties into this, what we're talking about. It's a book called Gospel Fluency by Jeff Vanderstelt. And it just carries with this idea of how do you make sure that the gospel is fully integrated into the whole of your life, that it's not simply something that you're doing to that's applicable only when you were converted to becoming a Christian,
right?
But it's something that is it roots everything in your life and every outlook you have about every situation in your life.
Yeah. And I love that book. It's not deeply complex.
Right.
It is approachable for, I would say, all readers, adult readers. And it just helps you just see the gospel and how it should be fluent.
Yep.
We've talked about in some of our discipleship, how we can compartmentalize the gospel and our faith.
Yep.
But we need to almost deconstruct the walls we've put up.
Oh, she said the D word.
I did say it, but we're not deconstructing our faith. We're deconstructing the boxes we put it in.
That's exactly right.
And I think once we learn how to remove some of those barriers we've created and imposed on ourselves, that fluency just goes.
Yep.
When you get the gospel, when you sit down and invite God into it, it just makes sense.
Yeah.
It should be that overflow in all of our lives.
Agreed.
And I mean, it is not through our own power.
Nope.
I'll leave you guys with that. Invite God into this. It's not something that you can muster up on your own strength. It is that invitation of Christ to help work in you to be that ambassador.
That's right. It's good. Thank you, Rachel.
Hey, you're welcome. Anything else you want to add before we wrap up today?
I just want to say I want to respond quickly to one question I received from someone on Sunday morning who said, hey, what do you do about HR issues?
Yes.
And how do you share the gospel at work when HR gets cranky?
Yep.
And here's a really simple answer to the question. And I'm happy to dialogue some more with people around this. Be creative. One of the things that HR can't really touch in most workplaces is what you do on your private time. Mm-hmm. And so they can't stop you from asking someone out for a coffee,
right,
or going out for dinner, or inviting someone over to your home where you can have private, personal conversations with someone.
Yep.
So be an ambassador for Christ in your work with how you work, how you relate to people, how you treat people. Mm-hmm. This person even said, I've been accused by people of being very different than everyone else. I'm like, that's good. That's what you want. And that is an open door. Mm-hmm. And so that is where I would say just honor your employer.
Yep.
But at the same time, honor Jesus and be creative and invite people into spaces where you can have spiritual conversations with them.
Yeah, and let your life at work reflect your love of Christ in your actions and your attitude.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Other than that, I would just encourage people, and I'll leave everyone with the question I left at the end of my message. When we look at this whole mission, making disciples of Jesus who love God, love others, and serve the world, the question for us as a church, individually and collectively, is, are we going to say yes to Jesus and make this the mission of our life?
Right.
Or is it just going to be an add-on to everything else? This needs to be the mission that drives us individually and collectively as a church family.
So take some time to reflect on that and where you are. Join us back next week where we wrap up the sermon series, Mission Forward, with moving the mission forward. So join us on Sunday at any one of our sites and tune back in next week, and we will just wrap this up and see what God is doing. Thanks for joining us, friends. We'll see you next week.